When you're coding with AI, the way you word your prompts can be the difference between building a full stack application in under an hour and troubleshooting for multiple hours and making absolutely no progress. I've spent over 1,000 hours coding with AI, and I've learned a lot of things along the way, so I will share those lessons with you today, as well as some specific prompts that you can use. So when it comes to writing new code, my first tip is to use a specific list of technologies or approaches that you want the AI to use. This is going to ensure that it's going to be easy for you to iterate on the code after the initial version is created, and make sure that all of the tools and technologies you're using actually make sense and work together well. Additionally, when you use specific technologies, it signals to the AI that you at least sort of know what you're doing, so the average output quality tends to be higher. Now, when it comes to choosing the specific technologies that you're going to use, I would lean heavily towards really popular languages and frameworks because AI is much more familiar with those, so the code that it writes is going to be higher quality. Also, you'll have a larger community to help answer questions, and you'll have many more clear examples available online that you can reference. So use things like JavaScript and Python and some common databases like Postgres, for example. If you're not sure of the specific technologies, I have a link in the description to the prompt guide that will show all of the prompts in this video, as well as a glossary of technologies that you can reference when crafting your prompts. My next tip for writing new code is to design a solution and then ask the AI to build it. Don't just give it a totally open-ended prompt. For example, if we have a website that shows a list of products and we want to add a search feature, we could ask the AI to just implement it, but that doesn't give enough specific detail on what should actually be done. Do we want the search to search just by product title? Should it be description? Should we have a bunch of different filters in there? You see, as you start to think about how the feature should actually be implemented, there's a lot more detail that comes out that you should really think through before you have the AI implement it. Because if you build it, and let's say you were assuming that it should use the description, but it's not searching by that, and then you just keep saying, well, it doesn't work, you'll just get stuck in an infinite loop. But if you think ahead of time how you want that feature to work and you spell it out for the AI, it's much more likely to do exactly what you want. This also makes it less ambiguous for the AI, so it's more likely to write good code. Now, since we're thinking through how the features should work and what we want the AI to do, one great way to organize your prompt is to break things down and give it a list of things that it needs to do. So instead of that open-ended build a search feature, we should say, build a search feature, and then it should work with titles and descriptions. Number 2, we should have the ability to filter by different product types. Number 3, we should add a sorting capability. If you give it a list of tasks, then it can focus on each one of those and implement everything kind of integrated all together instead of you then iterating on it step by step. Which brings me to the next point, which is that you really need to find the right balance of scope of work to give to the AI. Because if you give it just very small snippets of work to do, then you're going to spend a lot of time iterating and not making a lot of progress on your app. Like you could ask it to, move an icon here or add some padding there, but you'll just end up spending so much time that you could otherwise be building, entire features with. On the flip side, of course, if you ask for it to build an entire application, you can't expect that it's going to do that all in one go. So there's very much a balance to strike between the amount of work you give it being too little or too large. And knowing the right amount really just comes with experience, so I strongly recommend that you go and actually try to build apps using AI, and then you'll run into situations where you're asking for too much or you're spending so much time, in the little details. So definitely look to find the right balance. All right, my next tip is to use examples in your prompt. Let's say we are building a function to format dates. Well, it's going to be much easier for you to give it examples of what you want your dates to look like than to describe every possible edge case of how it should work. AI tends to do pretty well when it sees examples like that. And the other thing you can do with examples is give it sample code that already works. So if you have a certain library that you're trying to integrate with or a tool that you're integrating with, you can just find code online that already works and copy paste it and have the AI start from there. I found that to really accelerate and make it much more likely to succeed in the first go. And speaking of documentation, a lot of the AI coding tools have a feature that allows you to immediately reference some official documentation or search the web. Using these tools can really speed up your work because you don't have to go find the documentation or the specific thing on the web, and it can also improve the quality of the solution that the AI creates. When building something new, another thing you should try to do is make sure that the code that the AI wrote is both secure and performs well. And you can do this either in the original prompt that you make to the AI, or you can do it as an immediate follow-up after it successfully implements the feature. And you can simply ask if there are any security vulnerabilities that this introduces, and whether the approach that it took is the most efficient one. And it can also help to be proactive about this and consult the AI to see if there are any considerations or best practices when working with a particular piece of software or a particular feature that you're trying to develop. Now, when it comes to testing, you have two options. You can either do the same thing that we were talking about with security and performance and ask it as a follow-up, or you could actually take a test-driven development approach where the AI writes the test first and then implements the feature to make sure that it satisfies all of those tests. That way you can even make sure that it handles all of the edge cases before it starts writing any of the code. This works particularly well if you're using AI agents because you can have them iteratively write the tests, build the feature, run the tests to make sure that the feature passes all of them and doesn't break any other ones. And then if any of them fail, you can have the AI agent iterate on the code until all of them actually pass. And on the documentation front, it always helps to have your code be well documented, whether that's comments in the functions that you write or a nicely formatted README. You can also have the AI write documentation for your end users so they can figure out how the software actually works. Since the AI has access to your code, it can write very effective documentation that very precisely describes what should be happening. My final tip for writing new code is to be careful with how you name things. The old adage goes, there are only two hard things in computer science: cache invalidation and naming things. And it's more true now than ever because AI uses the names of your files, of your functions, of your classes to figure out what is actually happening in your code. And it's going to follow the patterns of your naming when it generates new code. So if you have a function that's intended to process CSVs, you should call it something like CSV parser rather than data parser, because then if you want to add parsing for different data formats, the AI is going to just try to jam everything into that function instead of writing a new one. So it's good to try to stay on top of the naming and keep it up to date, which really brings us to the next section of this video, which is what do you do when you're working with existing code and trying to modify it? Well, to continue the naming example, you want to continuously update the naming and organization of your code base as the code expands. And one way you can do this is to ask it to refactor and simplify your code. So this is a really handy prompt that I like to use, is to ask the AI to refactor a particular file. And I'll typically tell it the specific names of the things that I want to extract out into a new file. And this will keep your files very focused and keep your code base nicely organized, which is very important because at its core, coding with AI really has a lot to do with managing context. And this is really the golden rule of coding with AI. And if you take anything away from this video, it would be this: you have to properly manage and balance the context that you give to the AI. Because if you don't give it enough context to work with, AI is going to assume things about your code that might not be accurate. And then the new code that it writes fundamentally doesn't work with your existing code. And you end up in that super messy loop of trying to get it to fix itself. And then it doesn't know what to do because now you have code with one set of assumptions and code with another set, and it's all coexisting, and it just becomes a really big mess. So if you can give it relevant files to use in its context when it's writing some new code, that's the best way to get new code that actually works with your existing code. Now, on the other side of this is when you got too much context. If you got a file and it includes your entire piece of software and it's 5,000 lines long, the AI is going to get confused. It's going to start deleting portions of your code. It's going to create duplicate functions because it can't really find the relevant pieces of code that it needs to consider. And this becomes equally problematic because it just can't write code that works with your existing software. And a lot of people fall into this trap, and it's perfectly natural, especially when you're getting started and you don't know how to properly organize your code base. So naming things and continuously refactoring, right? That's what we were talking about earlier, becomes even more important because it allows you to tag the relevant files and pass that context to your subsequent AI requests. The other thing to keep in mind is that as you're having that conversation about the code and having AI generate new code, you are expanding the context because every message in your conversation gets passed to the AI and it goes through all of that when it generates new code for you. So if you've had a conversation that's been going on for like half an hour, AI is much more likely to get confused and start, referencing old pieces of code that don't exist anymore, or just failing to do what you ask it to do. And this is a tricky thing because you want to make sure that you have the relevant context, but the longer your conversation goes, the more context there is, and AI will start to get confused. So you got to really balance when you have too much context and too little context. So one powerful tool at your disposal is to start a new conversation. And one common way that I like to think about it is if you're building a new feature that doesn't directly have to do with everything you've built up to this point, that's when you should start a new chat. And then just tag the relevant files. You could even reference some parts of your previous conversation, but it's much better to have a fresh start when you're building something new. Ultimately, it is going to be a balance, and experience will guide you in terms of when it's good to continue a conversation versus start a new one. My next tip about iterating with code is to tell the AI what works well and what you want to be changed. So often my flow will go something like this. I'll ask the AI to implement a feature. I'll use a list to tell it what it needs to do. And it'll often make some mistakes. Like it'll make good progress towards what I want, but it won't be perfect. And so I like to tell it what did work and then what I still want to be changed, because this focuses its attention on fixing those things and makes sure that the things that it already implemented correctly don't become broken. Another thing I like to do when working with existing code is to ask it to find edge cases or potential bugs in the code that I'm working with. This is a good thing to add to your repertoire because it's going to make sure that you build quality software that's bug-free. So typically, if you build a feature, you go through the iterations, everything seems to work, now you should just go ahead and ask, are there any edge cases that we're not currently handling? Do you see any issues in the code? This will help you handle those additional cases and build a higher quality product. Speaking of reviewing the code after you've built the feature, another thing you can do is directly ask the AI to review the code. And this is something I like to do after I make some major changes. And of course, you always want to review the code yourself. You do want to see that things are implemented in the way that you expect them to work and that the AI isn't doing something unnecessary or insecure. So always review the code yourself, but you can use AI to essentially get a head start on that process by reviewing the code, and then you can walk through those results. It can be really helpful. Another thing I like to do is just ask the AI what the current code does and how it works, because this will usually highlight for me certain things that I might be missing and give me some context about the rest of the code base and how this code fits into it. It's much faster to get started like this than trying to read things line by line, especially when you're working with a large piece of code. And obviously, this is going to be super helpful if you're not 100% comfortable with code just yet in trying to understand how it all works. And then it'll actually help you learn how to code in the process. Moving on to the troubleshooting section. Inevitably, things will go wrong and there will be issues and there will be bugs, and the AI won't implement everything perfectly the first time around. So what do you do in those cases? Well, there are several prompts and techniques that you can use to really accelerate your troubleshooting. The first thing I like to do is to be very specific about what is going wrong and what is going right. It's similar to that prompt that we were talking about earlier, where you're iterating on a particular feature. Well, in the case of troubleshooting, when you're working out a particular bug, you really want to say like, this piece is working, but this other piece is not. And then you really want to dive into which cases things work and where they fail, and give it as much detail as you can. Oftentimes you can also share screenshots with tools that accept those, and that can actually help the AI understand what you're saying. Because if you're using words like, it's not centered or it's sticking all the way to the top, it might not really know the context in which you're talking about. But if you share a screenshot, it's going to help it understand and make the right change. Also, when it comes to troubleshooting, I find it's super helpful if you can just share the errors that you're getting with the AI. So just copy paste the entire error, and then it'll likely be able to figure out where the problem is. You can actually take this approach one step further and use what I call the Beaver Method and ask the AI to write a bunch of logs in your code that will help you then troubleshoot. And what you do is you create all of those logs, and then you try to run the program, and you copy paste all of that back to the AI. And it'll be able to figure out at what part of your process did something break. So because you're using logs instead of just waiting for an error, it gives it a lot more detail and context into what's going on. And I found that to be a really useful method in troubleshooting. Oftentimes, after just a couple of iterations using this approach, it'll be able to fix the issue. But sometimes even after doing a bunch of troubleshooting, you still end up kind of stuck and not sure where to go next. And so the first line of attack in that case is to ask the AI to describe what the code is currently doing. This goes back to that prompt we were talking about when modifying code, because if you can understand what the code is doing, it can help you understand why there's an issue in it. Perhaps there is a specific case that you hadn't accounted for, and the AI explaining that could help you actually see that problem and then think through how you would actually like to solve it, instead of just relying on the AI and assuming that it'll figure out the best way to handle it. But sometimes, even after you read it, it still doesn't make sense and you're still having an issue. So what do you do then? Well, I have one secret weapon for you. It is one word, and that word is radical. For whatever reason, I have found this word to be super effective in breaking through these troubleshooting loops. And specifically what I mean is you ask it to try something radically different. Try a radically different approach. And I've been really surprised by the number of times in which this prompt is the thing that gets me through the issue, because it really forces the AI to think differently. And instead of trying to adjust little details, it just backs all the way up and tries a really different approach. But sometimes even that doesn't work. So what do you do when you've been there for multiple hours, you've tried pasting the logs, you've tried a radically different solution? What do? You're stuck, right? Well, that's where you gotta actually know how to code. You gotta understand what the code is doing so that you can look into the code and find the problem. Maybe there's just a conceptual issue with the way you've been approaching the particular problem, and there's just no possible way that you can make it work. There may be fundamental constraints that you haven't considered or limitations with the technologies that you're using. So my final tip for troubleshooting is that you need to know when to pause and when to go look at the code. And there's, again, very much a balance to this, similar to some of the other prompts we were talking about. You have to know when you've hit that point at which it really doesn't make sense to keep asking the AI to fix it. Now, you don't want to do that right away, because oftentimes AI can work through a lot of issues, and if you just keep pasting the prompts or you tell it to take a different approach, it can be much faster to get through the problems that way than digging deep into the code and fully understanding it. So you can definitely save time by having AI try to troubleshoot itself in the ways that we've been talking about. But at some point, you do want to be able to go into the code and figure out what's happening. And of course, that brings us to our last section, which is about learning how to code. You can use AI to help you learn. And so all of these things we've been talking about, you don't absolutely need to know code to be able to do. But when you run into those issues where you get completely stuck, that's when it becomes suddenly absolutely necessary to know code and how it works. So I'll share some prompts and tips with you in terms of what you should ask when you're trying to learn how to code. And the first thing is you want to ask the AI to keep things simple and you want to tell it that you're a new developer and that you're learning how to code. If you don't do that and you just ask about how this function works or whatnot, it'll just assume that you have a developer understanding of the situation. But if you tell it that you're a new developer and you specifically ask it to keep it simple, it can really help it fine-tune that response to make sure that you can actually learn and understand from what it's saying. Now that's useful for explaining code at a high level, like when you're looking at a piece of code and you're asking for a description. But the thing that I also like to do is ask it to explain code line by line. And you can have it either just explain it in a chat, or you could have it add comments to your code so that you can follow along. And that will help you understand the syntax of what's happening, and then be able to learn. As you do that over and over, you're going to start to see a lot of patterns in the code, and then you'll be able to follow those, and you'll first know how to read it. And then when you run into issues, you might notice, hey, this doesn't look like the same kind of syntax or approach that we used in the past when doing this kind of thing. So then you can tell the AI, and that's really the process of learning, right? You're seeing these patterns, you're starting to understand how they all fit together. And if you ask it to explain things line by line, you'll start to have a deeper understanding of how the code actually works. But learning to code isn't just limited to the code itself. Like we've been talking about, it can really help to use specific vocabulary, specific technologies, concepts when you're formulating all these prompts. So you can actually use AI to learn those, and you can just specifically ask it to explain a particular concept and how it relates maybe to the code that you're looking at, or maybe even just outside the code. Ask it to explain how a full stack application works, or ask it to explain different data types in your table, for example. Just having those conversations with the AI about various components and technologies can raise your overall awareness of how software works and how all the pieces fit together. Another thing I like to do is ask the AI how it would build something. So let's say we want to build a chat app. I would ask, how do we do that? What are the architectural components for building a chat app? What are the things that we need to consider? And you'll soon realize there are different ways of implementing chat. Like you could have a central server, or you could have peer-to-peer communication. And again, these things, people don't tend to think about until you get into the weeds of coding, and then it suddenly becomes super important. And it goes all the way back to building our software and being specific about the features that we want to implement and how we want them to be implemented. So it all kind of loops back in on itself. You learn how to code, you understand the code, then you can give good prompts so you can build better code, right? And the cycle continues. Another thing you can do when learning is ask the AI to show you some examples. And we did this in the previous video where we were talking about software basics, and we had to generate, some examples in JavaScript showing functions, showing different data types. So that can be a really powerful technique to use as well. And as you're working through those examples or working on a particular piece of code, another thing that helps is to tell the AI what you do understand versus what is unclear, because then it'll be able to connect the things that are unclear. It'll focus on explaining those, and it'll connect them to the things that you do already understand. So it just creates a more complete picture of whatever it is you're exploring. My last tip is to focus less on the specific syntax of a language and focus more on the bigger picture and how various software components fit together. And that's where it really helps to actually understand what a full stack application actually looks like and what are the different layers of it, which is exactly what we're covering in the next video in the AI Coding 101 series, how full stack applications actually work. I hope to see you there. Thanks for watching. Take care.